Hello everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to view this video. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about artistic decision making and how that factors into portraiture. So whether you are planning on creating a portrait yourself or you are intending to read another artist's portrait, hopefully this presentation will give you a little bit of useful information to do that. So first, what we have to do is define a portrait. Like, what is it? So portraiture is art depicting one or more people, and it's a medium or a technique that has existed for thousands of years of human history. While a lot of portraits are realistic in the sense that they resemble the sitter or the subject of the portrait, there are oftentimes decisions that are made by the artist with the intention of showing the sitter in a certain light. This is especially important when it comes to artists who are commissioned to create images of certain people. Typically, throughout human history, the people who have the means to commission portraits are people who are in certain positions of power. This is something that has changed more recently with modern and contemporary art. However, when you are looking at a historical image, it is important to consider who commissioned this and why. So to give us an example of just looking at the variety of portraiture, I have 4 images up here representing work by artists from various regions of North Africa, in particular Nigeria, Egypt, and the Ivory Coast, and they all depict portraits of women. Take a note on how they're similar or perhaps they're different. And think to yourself, like, what is the image or the emotion or the message that is being communicated in each of these pieces? What does the artist want you to think of the sitter? What does the person who commissioned the portrait want you to think of the sitter? So what you'll notice about each of these artworks, and a lot of the artworks that you'll see today, in fact, is that artists make deliberate decisions in how their subject or subjects are depicted. These kinds of decisions are really important in terms of creating your piece or reading an artwork and how the audience perceives the artwork. I'm going to take you through some of those artistic decisions that are made that affect the audience perception of work. And I will also be providing several examples of how each of those decisions has manifested in various examples of artwork throughout history. So these are just a couple of the things that you can consider in portrait and artistic decision making. I'm going to be looking today at just a handful of those things that you can consider. I'm going to be looking today at literal versus expressive portraiture, the use of space and composition in portraiture, the use of backgrounds, colors, and the overall moods of portraits. So this image right here is particularly interesting. I actually use it in the AP Art History curriculum. So if you have taken AP Art History before, hopefully you recognize this image from the Africa curriculum. So the woman on the left of this composition, her name is Moya Yanso. And the mask that was intended to be her resemblance right here is being held by one of her relatives on the right here. So when you take a look at this mask and you look at the person that is intended to depict, you'll notice that there's a couple of key differences. Typically in the Western world, we tend to think of portraiture as something that exactly resembles the person that it is supposed to represent. This is not necessarily true throughout time or across world cultures. So sometimes portraits are made to represent the sitter on a more literal sense, how they appear in life, how they actually look. Sometimes portraits do not possess a physical resemblance to the sitter at all, and instead they take on an expressive, or in some communities you might even call it a spiritual resemblance to the sitter. An expressive resemblance might be stylized, or it might emphasize certain features, particularly those that might be idealized or revered within that specific community, or it might include culturally specific designs and motifs that might have been canonized or well established in that culture. So typically most portraits are still anthropomorphic in some way. Anthropomorphic is a word that we use in art history to describe something that contains human elements and or shapes. So we look at it and we can essentially recognize it as human. So portraits will more oftentimes than not contain elements of both of these facets of identity, both literal and expressive. Sometimes the expressive elements are going to be more subtle, and other times they're going to be a little bit more obvious, like we're seeing here in Moya Yanso's mask right here. So keep in mind that the medium or the material that an artist is using to create a portrait is not necessarily going to correlate exactly with whether a portrait is more literal or more expressive. Typically, people tend to assume that photography, for example, is a more objective medium, that it reflects reality exactly. The fact of the matter, however, is that photography is not objective at all. And we can actually manipulate several elements of a photograph, things like composition, things like lighting, our point of view, to make our viewer think or feel a certain way when they look at our images. So for example, this image right here shows 15 different views of the exact same man. They have the exact same composition in terms of the amount of space that his face is taking up in the images. The only thing that is changing in these images is the lighting situation. His facial expression is even the same in all of them, but we might perceive them differently based on how the light is hitting the planes of the face. For example, this image over here seems particularly menacing, especially because we can't really read aspects of the face. There's a sense of mystery to it. We don't really entirely know what's going on, and that makes us uncomfortable. There are some views of the face that will even make this figure appear older than he actually is as well. Oftentimes the perceived age of the subject is going to affect how we feel about them. So these are just a couple of things to consider. Photography is not a purely objective medium. So a lot of artists have kind of oscillated throughout time in terms of their preference for a subjective portrait versus a more objective portrait. Artists like Pablo Picasso provide us with wonderful records of how they have perceived or depicted themselves throughout history. Artists like Pablo Picasso lived for many decades and existed within the context of many different artistic periods. Pablo Picasso in particular lived through many artist movements throughout the 20th century. So we have a really interesting record in terms of how he perceived himself over time. You'll see that he's depicting himself using different media. You'll see that he's depicting himself from different points of view, and of course, as you would expect, at different ages as well. The next thing we're going to talk about is composition and space. So a composition refers to how your subject or subjects are going to be arranged on a page. Typically, composition is also referenced in terms of what is taking up space and what is not. So we talk about this usually in terms of positive space, or the space that is being taken up by an object. So in this case, that'll be everything in the purple right here. And then the negative space is the area that is not being taken up by an object. In this case, that's going to be the yellow right here. So you'll notice that in these various thumbnails, right here, a thumbnail is a fancy word for like a little mini composition sketch, that we see a human figure in each of these images right here, but we're seeing different points of view. Some of these are more frontal, we're seeing them from the front. Others are a more three-quarter view. Some of them are from further away and we see more of the body, and then others are really up close. In the case of this figure right here, we're really seeing nothing but the face. So if you are a person who is making a decision in terms of how zoomed in, as it were, that you are going to be on your portrait, this is an important consideration to make. Are we going to see basically only your face, or are we going to see kind of like more narrative or storytelling elements of what your body is doing, what your hands are doing, what position your shoulders are in, whether you're facing us or turning away from us? These are all important decisions to make and consider. So here are some examples of how artists in the past have experimented with space and composition in portraiture. Again, you'll notice that there's different scales, there's different points of view. This painting right here by Diego Velázquez shows Velázquez, the artist, right here in the action of painting, but he is certainly not the focal point of this image. We sometimes will see multiple points of view simultaneously, like with this image right here by artist Rasman. With Lucian Freud over here, it's almost as if the camera is tilting up towards him and he's looking down at us. So these kinds of images are going to portray different moods and different feelings for the audience. Are they looking at us? Are they looking away? Are they doing something else? Are they aware of our presence or not? Background is also an important element, and this goes hand in hand with composition. If your piece is zoomed in or closely cropped, then you won't have much of a background to worry about, like you're seeing with this little thumbnail sketch that I've created out here. But if you zoom out or include more of the body besides the face and neck, then you'll have to consider what to put there. Typically, you don't want to just have it be blank space. People don't exist in a lack of context. People don't exist in these blank white rooms. So oftentimes it is important to consider, what am I going to put back there? And if this is a self-portrait that you're creating, for example, you'll want to put something back there that perhaps communicates something about your identity or your personality. And these things can go beyond a physical resemblance. Sometimes figures will be engaged in some sort of narrative that relates to their identity. So in this image right here, Makita Ohuya, we actually see her in the studio. We can see some paintbrushes right here on her desk. We can see a mirror over here. We see some sort of portrait on the wall that shows a figure that might be the artist embracing a man. So this is telling us perhaps a little bit about her studio space or where she's working, and she's not facing towards us. This image over here shows the artist in the act of doing her hair. And we can see a point of view of her perhaps looking at herself while she's doing her hair in a mirror, and we can see some of the objects that are in her room or perhaps on her armoire or her vanity that would be involved in her doing her hair. With Vincent van Gogh, for example, we are seeing a background that on its face might seem simple, but we're very used to seeing these kinds of undulating brushstrokes and forms in Van Gogh's work, particularly when it comes to depicting things like clouds. So that could tell us a little bit about the artist's kind of like more expressive or subjective view of themselves. With Frida Kahlo, as a surrealist artist, we oftentimes see backgrounds of things that don't necessarily reflect reality, but they might reflect the state of mind of the sitter. In this particular case here as well, she did actually own a monkey during her lifetime, so this could be her pet. She also experienced chronic pain during her lifetime, so it's possible that these thorns around her neck are a representation of that pain. Mood is another really important subjective input for portraiture. There are a lot of decisions that are being made on the part of the artist in terms of how the subject is depicted, and mood is one of the most important. When we look at these images right here of Napoleon, we see basically 3 different stages of his life. So even though we're seeing the exact same figure and he looks like he is of a similar age in all of them, the artists are making very deliberate decisions to show him in certain light. So in the Jacques-Louis David piece right here, we can see Napoleon on his horse with his hand pointing outward. This kind of pose is very common in equestrian statues from the ancient Roman era, and it's oftentimes used to demonstrate the importance or the right to rule of an emperor. So we see him here very triumphant. His cloak is billowing behind him. He's facing towards us, the audience. He looks confident. His face is placid. He is and he's taking up a massive part of this composition, or at least he and his horse are taking up a massive part of this composition. He seems triumphant here. In this image right here, we see him slumped in a chair. It's a lot less formal. He is obviously not having the best day right now. Look at that furrowed brow. His neck is kind of shrinking back into his shoulders. This is very much a communication of a narrative of defeat. He's abdicated. This image right here shows a part in Napoleon's life where he has essentially been exiled. So the boat that has presumably dropped him off on this island is leaving him behind, and he is facing away from us. He is also a lot smaller in this composition compared to how large he is in these compositions. You'll also kind of perceive that he's kind of standing in a contrapposto pose, kind of a little bit more casual, in his arms we might think are perhaps crossed across his chest. So it's a lot less formal, and it's almost comical to see like this figure over here with his little Napoleon hat, decidedly less triumphant. He has nothing to lead anymore. He is past his usefulness in a sense. The background is also a more somber one. We're not seeing a sun breaking through the clouds. This is a cloudy kind of dreary day. Speaking of which, color is going to be another important consideration to make. It is really easy to get overwhelmed with the variety of colors available. I see a lot of artists who, for example, are determined to use every single color in their palette when they're creating an image, particularly a portrait. But in reality, it's oftentimes a better idea to create a restricted palette, to limit the colors that you are using so that you can create a sense of cohesiveness in your image. Color can go a long way as well in terms of depicting the mood of your piece. A portrait that uses mostly blues, for example, like we saw with Napoleon's image over here, or like we're seeing with Pablo Picasso's piece over here, might, for example, seem somber or more subdued or cool. There's less action that's happening. I highly recommend determining a color palette for your piece before you get started. Sometimes I will see artists that will color in thumbnails, like one of my former students has done over here. I have also seen artists that will create colors using palettes generated online. One of my favorite is coolers.co. I highly recommend using this palette generating software. It's completely free and it's very useful. Here are some examples of how other artists have experimented with color in portraiture. So a lot of the examples that are used here are using more bright and saturated colors, which is certainly an option that you can utilize. You will also notice that the artists are not necessarily using realistic skin tones in their pieces, and that's totally okay as well. Oftentimes, for example, with the artist Ernst Kirchner, he is using yellow and green to portray a figure that is ailing or sick. With Bisa Butler, she is oftentimes choosing fabrics in her quilts, yes, this is a quilt, which is absolutely amazing, to create figures that are very bright and vibrant. And even though the colors are very bright, she's balancing them in such a way that our eyes are still going to these figures. We focus on them. So this is just a recap. Today we covered literal versus expressive portraiture, composition and space, background, mood, and color. So again, these are only a couple of the things that you should consider when you're creating a portrait or reading a portrait. In any case, hopefully this should give you a good jump start in terms of reading portraits or creating your own. Thank you so much for your time today. I very much appreciate it. I'll see you next time.